Welcome to Safety Series number 14, Emergency Action Plans. This can be found in the OSHA Standards 29 CFR 1910.38. In today's episode, we will sit down and cover the minimum requirements for this plan. Keep in mind, when you say the minimum requirements, this is just enough to get you started. Your own site-specific things are really going to be your site-specific hazards are really the ones that are going to be driving the planning process and this whole thing. This podcast is brought to you by the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast and Applied Safety Management. My name is Dr. David Ayers. Let's get started. So we've already covered where to find this in the standards, the federal standards. Then keep in mind that perhaps your state has more of a strict standard out there too. So we are going to talk about from the federal aspect only. So let's go over the minimum requirements. And it must be in writing, it must be available for employees. But there is a little small caveat. If you have less than 10 personnel, you can communicate the plan orally then. So as part of the plan, you have to have procedures for reporting a fire, such as are you going to dial 911? In this case, when we look at the map that somebody has here, is that you're going to dial 000. So you have to list exactly how a person is going to report a fire, emergency. You might have a gas leak. You may have some other form. So the word has to get out to outside help then. So types and routes of evacuation. You can see by looking at the map, this is just a standard office. They have a small conference room on the bottom and kind of shows the doors and how to get out from point A to point B. It does show a portable fire extinguisher and a first aid kit. One of the big things that shows, and let me see if I can do this on a highlighter here, a "You are here" button also then. So it lets you know exactly where you are in this whole when looking at the map and everything. It does seem strange, but some people can work in the same place their whole life, and then when something real happens, they just lose their mind. They can't figure out how to get out of a place they've worked at for 20 years then. So this is also handy if there's contractors who may not be familiar with your site. You're hosting visitors. There's just something that maybe is not a day-to-day basis then. So let's go on to the next slide here. You have to list procedures for folks to follow if they're going to stay and run any critical processes then. So it might be that if there's some form of fire evacuation or something, people will stay behind and close valves, turn things off first to make it safe so that then they can then go and evacuate. If you had a issue, but you had something, just throwing something out there as a example, something under pressure and heat, and you continue to do the pressure and heat, but it was manned by a person, and that person evacuates, well, now you have a potentially a uncontrolled issue going to happen. Fire, explosion, pressure release, something happening. So you always have to have a plan for unless everybody all leaves at the same time, who's going to stay and kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of button up the plant as you're getting ready to leave here then. So, and the same thing works for offices too then. So although with offices, your level of hazard is greatly reduced. You also have to have a way that you can sit down and account for everybody then. So firefighters are really into helping out and putting out fires and saving lives and all that stuff. Then they are typically focused on finding the people first. So if the person is not there and you don't know they aren't there, they might be wasting precious time and energy trying to find a person that's not there when they can be using that time and that energy to help others, to put the fire out and other things. So you always have to have a way of accounting for people out there. Let's go to the next slide here. You have to list any procedures for people who are going to do any medical first aid. Are they going to do a rescue? Whatever their duty might be then. So there's a lot of places out there that really depend on outside help. So it's really easy for them just to write that they're going to depend on outside help. But there's also a lot of remote places where you can depend on outside help, but you will not have outside help for 10 or 15 minutes as they get from point A over to your facility to help you out. So any of the medical duties, rescue, you may have your own group of people who are trained to put out gas leaks. If there's any fire, some people have their own trained fire staff on hand. Finally, you have to have not finally, but you have to have a point of contact for personnel to go back and talk to for more information then. So that's typically the person who wrote the plan and is in charge of the plan. And when we talk about the plan, it's also a living, breathing document, because at times you will introduce more hazards, you will reduce hazards also. So people should not think of I wrote this plan and it sits on inside of a binder that nobody can find. And then if there's something that happens, we open up the binder and actually read it and see what this whole thing says. Anytime as part of the planning process that you can get people involved in it, they have a lot more ownership of it. And when they have more ownership, then they're really going to follow it. They really believe in it. Plus, they can give you insights that you don't have. As an author of many of these plans, I can write a killer plan from my office. Does it really mean that it's even true and valid, because I'm not the one who has to do these hazards? I'm not exposed to them. I don't understand the layout of the plant. These guys do, because they work there all day, every day. So let's go on to the next slide here. Types of alarms then. So depending on where you work, you could have a different alarm for a fire, as opposed to a toxic gas leak, as opposed to an oxygen deficient atmosphere. So whatever you have for your different alarm systems, types and sounds, and any actions to take out there. So it is not uncommon to have even another separate sound for a shelter in place. So employees have to know exactly when they hear and see these things, what actions to take. We really don't want people to stop, to pause, to then say, I really have to find somebody because I'm not exactly sure what I'm supposed to be doing, because they may actually be going into a hazard, or because it's a shelter in place, they may be actually walking outside where the hazard is. So a shelter in place typically means that there's something worse outside than inside your plant. And when you think about that, most people think about a weather event. You could have a tornado, other types of weather events happening, so it's safer to stay inside as opposed to outside. So let's go on to the next slide here. And then finally, when we talk about training, so you do it at initial hire. If the employee, their duties change, of course, during the course of their employment. And then, of course, if the plan is changed. So it's really easy to capture people at new hire. It gets a little bit harder when you have like a second and third shift, and it's just more difficult to get the word out. But that's also why that there are supervisors and managers and other people out there. So anybody who writes this plan and thinks I can sit down and communicate it and manage it to 200 people working over 3 shifts, 24/7, you're going to miss people. Life just gets in the way. There's going to be a flat tire. So you got to come up with some kind of a way that once the plan changes, or a person changes job duties, that you go back, you train them again, and that you have a way that you can document this whole thing too then. So, and that is it for Safety Series number 14, Emergency Action Plans. Please remember that this was only the minimum requirements by OSHA. Check your state. Also, of course, driving what your planning process is are going to be the hazards that you have in your facility. Thank you so much for joining me. I'd like to thank the Occupational Safety Leadership Podcast for sponsoring this, and have a safe day.